The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this latest webinar in the International Society of Chief Data Officers series on how data leaders succeed. Before we start, just a quick spiel. We are born out of the society, that is born out of the MIT CDO IQ Symposium, and we're a society for data leaders by data leaders, and we're trying to sort of fill the gaps between symposia, but also to create our own body of knowledge that our members can use. And if you like this, if you like the idea of what we're doing, I urge you to go to ISCDO at we are at iscdo.org, where you'll find our website and how to join. If I can begin, then we're very fortunate today to have Glenn Carney with us. Glenn is a highly experienced project organizational consultant with a background in mentoring data leaders, technical staff, the chief data officer, all the whole range of people involved in creating data value within organizations. He has worked at federal level, at state level, and with non-profits, and across many sectors in the private realm, in finance, in aviation, construction. I could go on and list to us today, and he's going to be talking, as his title suggests, about rethinking data collection and storage strategy. Perhaps one of the topics of the moment as businesses decide where and how to study to save and store their data. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. And a big welcome to you, Glenn. And over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Again, my name is Glenn Carney. I am based in the Kansas City metropolitan area in the US. I have had a variety of jobs in my career, as most have, including in corporate and in consulting. Under my picture there, I say I'm a data warehouse recidivist. I use that as a joke because there was a point in my career where I swore off building data warehouses and I was never going to do it again. Obviously, today we don't necessarily talk about just data warehouse. We talk about the whole data ecosystem and infrastructure. So that's what we'll be talking about today. As the introduction indicated, I have quite a bit of experience. I think that's just a very polite way of saying I'm old. I built my first data warehouse in 1993, working at Hallmark Cards, and we were working primarily with point of sale data at that point in time. But in the last few years, I've evolved into more of a strategic advisory and technical advisory role. I do hold some technical certifications, and in the last 7 years, I've built 9 successful warehouses, and so far I've had none that fail. At least since 1993. Rescuing data warehouses is kind of a specialty of mine, and oftentimes that involves a lot of the technical side. Again, I'm based in Kansas City, and on a personal level, I am currently trying to learn the art of kumiko, which is the Japanese geometric woodworking process. There's a slightly more current photograph of me, a fair amount of weight, and I think it was mostly dark hair that I lost to lose that weight. Because I've listed there my sector experience, and I'm sure you've already had a chance to see that, so I won't go over it again. With that, I'll move on to today's topic. So, as you may be aware, and likely are, that in the building collections or being a chief data officer and your team today, you have a variety of challenges, right? You have to be able to build solutions that are sustainable both in terms of capacity, cost of ownership, and relevance. Value chain to the business has to be done quickly, which requires business focus. And of course, we're always balancing the ability to be agile with the ability to govern what we're doing and do it in an orderly fashion. Also, of course, we're all required to keep up with changes in pretty much everything as we work. And so the landscape that we work in is pretty challenging. I'm using the analogy here of making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And I'll apologize for the overlap in the graphic and the text. I had to make a last minute computer change this morning, so I'm on a different format screen than I was planning for today. So we may see some of that. I'll apologize in advance. So, building that silk purse out of the sow's ear, using the raw materials that you have available, you've got distributed sources that are changing all the time. And I can tell you from building something like 10 data warehouses in the last 10 years that that's pretty much the norm. That problem isn't going to go away. Of course, there's scaling considerations. We've got data with all kinds of structure. We used to talk primarily about structured and unstructured data. It's more of a spectrum really now. You'll see providers of data, particularly third-party data models, that are blending structured and unstructured data in the same structures. A lot of these systems today are poorly governed. One that comes to mind for me, and if there's anyone from the Salesforce organization on the call, I apologize in advance, but I see a lot of poorly governed Salesforce implementations in my work, and that's because it's a very flexible tool, right? So as software has become more flexible and easier to customize to your organization's needs, governance has suffered in some ways, and the complexity of dealing with those models has increased dramatically. Of course, on the business side, we've got business rules that may or may not be in place, and oftentimes those are going to be defined by the vendor rather than by your organization. Or likely the organization will need to adapt your processes in some manner to the affordances provided by that third-party design software. Distributed authority is another thing. We hear about data mesh these days, and we're going to get into talking about different architectures here in just a few minutes. But one of the features of data mesh is distributed authority, putting the data and the authority with that data where it belongs with that business unit. That introduces complexity that we don't have in a more traditional environment. And of course, the constant financial and staffing constraints that we all deal with. So those two things, those two sets of factors together, the requirements from the business and the frankly difficult set of materials that we are given to work with to build these collections, creates some interesting scenarios. Now, one of the things that happens, and I think this is the only statistics that I will bother you with today, but and honestly, both of these were given to me. So if anyone challenges me on the source, I'm fairly confident in the one on the left. I'm not as confident in the one on the right, but there's a pretty well accepted statistic that about 70% of ERP and digital transformation projects fail relative to business expectations, and that's a number that hasn't really changed significantly in the last several years. My good friend Peter Aiken, who many of you are probably familiar with already from these calls, quotes that number very frequently. So data warehouse projects typically are rebuilt 7 times. That's a reflection of architecture not being flexible enough and not being robust enough to absorb change, and or perhaps not being well planned enough. So we see responses to that in terms of, for a while, you could go to Amazon and log into the Amazon Web Services portal, and you would see a banner that said the data warehouse is dead. You now should build your data lake, of course, on AWS. The reality of that is, and this is probably the thesis of the presentation today, is that it's not so much about the tools you choose, but about how you organize and plan with those tools that determines the success or failure of a platform. Obviously, you may be familiar with this image. I think this is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge that kind of famously failed in the 1920s from a poorly engineered bridge for the location that it was. You've all probably seen that video. So moving into some basic architectural designs here, and I was asked to not make this presentation terribly technical today. That is certainly in my capability to be overly technical at times, so trying to avoid that. But this is a pretty standard architecture that we see in industry, in nonprofit, in government. Quite honestly, this is pretty much standard architecture. I used to title this slide Common Data Architecture or Common Data Landscape. You'll see this, something similar to this is often trotted out by vendors such as Oracle, Snowflake, others. So it's fairly widely accepted. So on the left, we have our sources for our collection sources coming in, and they come from a variety of different sources, and with each of those sources with its own set of challenges. We're doing some level of export and transformation to gather that data. We're capturing it either in a data lake or in a data warehouse or some combination. And then we're doing some preparation, refinement of that work. We might think of that as data marts or other solutions for presenting data. And then we're pushing it out on the other end of the pipe to our executives, our ad hoc users, and our data scientists, folks like that. The structure here reflects, in my opinion, what is a fairly well accepted architecture. The issues that this presents, however, really get kind of interesting, because moving data from the lake to the warehouse, things like that, and coordinating data between those two, particularly when the components of the architecture may be physically disconnected, or it may be not cost effective to tightly integrate those because of geography, because of telecommunication costs, whatever. So, or because of business decisions such as distributed authority for systems. So the challenges here really start to pile up, and we're going to hopefully talk about some of those today. So where we end up, and this is kind of traditional, is I typically find clients, and it's true in most sectors, who are trying to rationalize a decision to build a warehouse or to build a data lake. And there's sort of a false choice presented by a lot of vendors. I referred to one earlier with Amazon, where we see this as an either-or decision. And I would say 8 out of 10 clients that I start working with, when I'm speaking to the chief architects or the chief data officer, this is the first question that they want to talk about. Maybe everyone on this call has already passed this issue, but in my opinion, this is not an or choice, this is an and choice. The problem is that these two solutions don't often share keys very well, so that we have an integrated solution. So what we're seeking here, and I can't tell you how long I had to Google to find 2 couples that aren't the same people, but we've got solutions for, we need to be able to move data between multiple platforms. So we've got a lady here with her phone and a guy here with his laptop, right? But the solution to this is, just like with your phone and your laptop, it's the ability to seamlessly move data between and not lose track of the identity and the lineage of that information as we move seamlessly between those solutions. So some of the components of that are shared keys. We'll talk more about in a few minutes. A shared catalog, meaning metadata and a definitional structure that allows us to understand the data. And then integrating as we can, both physically and virtually, and of course being open to multiple platforms. So again, sort of another take on reiterating those same challenges as we begin to address the architecture. So thinking about what are some of the characteristics of a sustainable collection more specifically that would allow us to be more successful with this type of an approach. So I'm going to start with metadata as the foundation. The older I get and the more experience I get, the more important I think this is. And that's not to say I didn't think it was important earlier, but it is paramount. One of the architectures that we're going to talk about today is a hub and spoke architecture. You may have heard of it referred to as a data vault. That architecture is highly adaptable to automation, and metadata is the key to that automation. And when I talk about highly adaptable to automation, I'm referring to the build and maintenance process for the collection. So rather than have a lot of people, munging code and munging data, there are tools and processes that we can leverage metadata to bring the same level of automation to the collection building and collection management process that we expect to bring to our business clients when we work with them, for example, on an ERP implementation. We expect them to re-engineer their process. And I think one of the aha moments in my career as a consultant has been kind of the recognition, and I'm a little embarrassed to probably say how late in my career this may have been, but the recognition that we in the technology field will hire an army of people to, and I have sat in rooms full of dozens and dozens of consultants from multiple firms doing this type of work, where we will hire an army of people to do technology work manually. And if we had a business partner, whether it was our accounting team or our product management team or our customer service team, and they presented us and said, this is our process, where we hire a bunch of outside folks and they sit in this room and solve this problem, I think most of us in the technology field would scoff and say there's a better way to do that through automation. And I guess my aha moment was we don't always apply that same concept to ourselves. So enough about metadata. Common and shared keys. What I mean by that is the ability to resolve to the same technical primary key in any system that we have in our distributed infrastructure without necessarily connecting the governing system to the remote system. And so again, in this hub spoke architecture, there are some concepts that we'll talk about. And if we have time or if there's questions, we can get into more detail. But effectively, we've got to have a key structure that is capable of absorbing changes and that can be leveraged anywhere in the ecosystem of data without necessarily requiring a home run lookup to the warehouse or to whatever the primary source of record for that key is. We have to be able to reliably, essentially compute the key. We want to manage relationships. Moving on, we want to manage relationships in the collection in the most homogeneous way possible, meaning we don't want to redefine relationships between entities in our collections any more often than we have to. And that means that, and really never, it would be ideal. And that means that we need a structure. Usually it's an associative table type of a structure. And in the data vault world, we might refer to that as a link. But those are designed in a very specific way to effectively manage the relationships between entities in our collection, regardless of what happens in the future. And that comes back to our common shared keys. The structure of those common keys has to be able to absorb change, right? Which means we can't be redefining structures and tables every time we have a change in business rules. Another huge piece is non-linear or parallel loading of our collections. Again, eliminating the need for the home run back to the source of record for the business keys or the technical keys allows us to load tables really in any order in our collection. And so as long as I can compute correctly the known or the common shared key for this entity, I don't need to talk to the other system to do that, which means I can load the dependent table before the parent table is finished loading, for example, in an identifying relationship. Another key component of that is standardizing design, standardizing the components that we use. In the same way that General Motors uses the same taillights for 2 or 3 vehicles, or the same seat belts for all of their vehicles, we want to be able to do something like that for our structures in our collection. We want to be able to have reusable components, and we want to be able to produce those very, very quickly based on known information like metadata. So by having the metadata in place, by having a definition for how we're going to define our common shared keys, and the ability to compute or arrive at correct keys, regardless of where we find ourselves in the ecosystem, the ability to leverage those keys into these homogeneous relationships once they're known, enable the parallel processing, and then also build standard components, which means, guess what? We can automate our own work. Of course, there's always a necessity for a shared catalog that refers back to our metadata again, but that catalog ideally should go from the business concept all the way down to the technical structure. And I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that every one of my clients has a fully mature shared catalog at this point. They don't. All of these pieces, need to happen at some point, but metadata, you'll probably start with technical metadata if you're concerned with building the collection. If you're more concerned with defining the collection, you may start with the business side of that data, but that catalog needs to merge at some point with the technical and business metadata. And then finally, and I've referred to this 2 or 3 times already, however, the concept here of being flexible and able to absorb change. This is one of those Microsoft PowerPoint smart art things that you have the little icons and your limited choice, but I thought the roller coaster icon might be a good example of how it feels when you're on the data ops team and a new system or a new version of a system comes in, and there's new changes that have to be threaded through all of the data warehouse, data lakes, all of the relevant collections. It can be very interesting. So again, the common shared keys in the center at the top of this slide are there for a reason. The common shared keys, the well-managed metadata, and the homogeneous relationships are really key to enabling the benefits that you see on the lower portion of the slide. Flexibility is the goal, and the other items here reflected are really the components that create that flexibility. It's the ability of the collection to absorb change, and I won't insult your intelligence by saying that everything that we build is perfectly able to absorb every change that comes along, but we can certainly minimize. And how I refer to it, and this is probably reflective of my past, but kind of what is the blast radius, if you will, of a change. When a new system, a new version of software comes in, business rules change, whatever, those are the events that cause data warehouse collections to be rebuilt up to 7 times in their lifetime. So finding methods and techniques for minimizing that is really crucial. Probably enough on that. So back to our Lakehouse architecture, just briefly, we'll touch on this slide one more time. What we're talking about there is the ability to actually know and calculate the keys that are used either in the warehouse or in the data lake through a function, a deterministic function that is going to give us the same output given the same input. And as long as we can execute that code or refer to that function in the platform we need, that's a big piece of that. So these data lakes can be disconnected completely. other than when there's occasionally a pipeline connection. The data lake could also be tightly integrated, much like a Databricks or that type of a product. So what's happened? What's happened here is in the industry, a consensus has developed. It was some of the initial concepts were developed by this gentleman. His name is Dan Lindstad. If you're not familiar with him, Dan might even be on the call for all I know. But since then, there's been quite a collection of folks who've stepped forward to say this is the right way to do it. And when I say the right way to do it, it's this hub and spoke architecture that allows us to accomplish all of those elements that I had on the previous slide: the flexible keys, the expected key values, well-defined metadata, all of those things. And in my opinion, the point of this slide really is that just almost everyone is getting on board with at least a lot of influential folks. I shouldn't say almost everyone, but many highly influential folks in this field are jumping on board this concept. Not everyone is calling it Data Vault. There's other names that are being used for it, and there are definitely some different versions or different permutations of the hub and spoke concept that are emerging within the field here. But even folks like the Kimball Group and Bill Inman, and if you're not familiar with those folks, I've got some links for you so you can familiarize yourself if you're not. But many of those folks are now or signing on to the Data Vault concept, or the hub and spoke concept at least. And that includes Microsoft, it includes Snowflake. I don't have anything that tells me yet that Oracle has signed on to that. But two or three of the most influential people who I believe that, and folks that I follow and believe that are highly influential in the industry, are now adopting the Data Vault approach as the starting point. And initially, that came from the idea that you're going to build a data warehouse in this architecture no matter what. And so anytime a data warehouse comes into the conversation, for the last 40 years or so of data warehousing, there's been this: how do you build it? Do you build dimensional? Do you do it the Inman way or the Kimball way? A lot of that came down to kind of almost like agile versus waterfall. Do you define everything up front and then begin your building and construction process? Or do you work through individual pieces of your architecture, serving up ready-made components to the business and hope that you end up in a good place? The point of this slide is both Inman, Kimball, and the folks at Snowflake, even Microsoft now, many others are adopting this approach as the right way to manage the collection. So I'm going to go ahead and use the term Data Vault here because I think everyone knows that's what I'm talking about. Essentially, this approach enables all of the items that we've talked about. It enables this metadata first approach. In fact, it really requires the metadata first approach, which is one of the very nice things about it. It's got a hub and spoke architecture, meaning I have one and only one definitional structure for the identity of an element in a collection. In other words, one contact in the contact table is defined in a hub, right? And there's other information about that contact in other tables that also the spokes can represent entities in our collection, and those spokes are defined to be very flexible. Again, if the keys change or the business rules change, generally speaking, the spoke is the only thing that needs to be modified. in the collection, not the entire collection. The integration at a distance is huge, and I can dig into that in more detail if anyone is interested. But essentially, it comes back to in the same way that we define our metadata first, we define the key structure that we're going to use up front, and that needs to be a key structure that is the same, physically the same, for every entity in our collection. So in my case, my keys are always 40 bytes of binary text. Don't have to get super technical on that, and I have a whole library of functions that always produce 40 bytes of binary text. And I can cram a whole bunch of data into 40 bytes of binary text. And really with minimal to no risk of any kind of key collisions there. What that enables us to do is to pack as much or as little information into a key as necessary, so we can have one table that has the same exact key structure and it has one column only that defines the primary key. I can have another table that has 10 columns that define the primary key, and it all fits neatly into that identical physical structure. And what that means is if I change business rules, I don't physically change the database, I just change the code that is being used to load the database. Again, that's part of managing that blast radius of any change that comes into the ecosystem. Focusing on repeatable components that are easy to automate. Again, I've talked about the deterministic keys. This is becoming, as I said, the best practice for a sustainable warehouse. And I will extend that to say that I think in the very near future, it is going to be the accepted best practice for managing the entire collection. And I've got a slide that talks about that or not. In a minute, I've used the term collection and warehouse somewhat interchangeably throughout this presentation. I'm cognizant that those are not necessarily always the same thing, and I'll explain a little bit more about why I'm starting to blur that line in a minute. And then again, there's a growing consensus amongst, and this is the alarming or the surprising, pleasantly surprising part, is it's among people who previously have squabbled about the right architecture for a data warehouse or for this ecosystem. And there's again, a consensus is building here. First time that I can remember in my career that a widespread consensus like this is present. There's more information available regarding Data Vault specifically and this hub and spoke architecture. I've identified some resources here, and I'm happy to share those with anyone on the call who's interested. So a couple of these links are resources for training, consulting, as well as just general information on the Data Vault structure. My advice to you would be, if you're getting hung up on the technical aspects of Data Vault, don't think of it as Data Vault, think of it as hub and spoke, and think about, as I've tried to do in this presentation, the concepts that really make it work. If you're not hung up on Data Vault, then I highly recommend that you look into that in terms of designing the collection. You will hear some downsides to Data Vault, and I can tell you as a practitioner that those are real. There are a lot of tables and there are a lot of joins in pulling data out of it. You need to get past that because the benefits overall for cost of ownership make this approach worthwhile. And I've got a pretty good list of clients now who will attest to that in multiple sectors. The last thing that I will point out on this slide is this link right here. My friend Bill Inman just has put out a blog post here in the last couple of weeks, and it actually talks about the merging of the concept of the Lakehouse and data warehouse and data lake, and whether they're one thing or the other. And so if anyone's hung up on the data warehouse versus data lake question, I highly encourage you, or if your teams are hung up on those questions, I highly encourage you to pass this article along It also has a comment stream below it that has a vigorous discussion, but it very succinctly illustrates the concepts that I've talked about today. With that, that is the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Super, thanks, Glenn. That was yes, I was following that in great detail, just listening and getting to grips with this new concept. And I think that from the way that the audience is responding, I think everybody else was as well. They're probably too busy scribbling to put up a question for the moment. But let's just look at this. One of the things you talk about, or you talked about it in this, is how these concepts you pull them together, and how they sort of contribute towards lowering the barriers and achieving what people want, which is a sustainable, well-governed platform that will perform over its lifetime, rather than the constant change, and how it sort of allows for innovation and flexibility.
Absolutely. Yeah, the flexibility is, I'm assuming that's a question, but yeah, the flexibility is absolutely key. There is no worse conversation than the conversation with the CEO that says, I need to fund another project to rebuild this data warehouse. Believe me, I've made that presentation in my career, and it was very close to the end of that job. And that probably wasn't a coincidence. So, those are tough conversations. They're tough conversations with the team. And so the elements here are, honestly, I believe there's a certain amount of genius in the data vault approach. I was a little skeptical, to be honest, at first, because, as I said, I had sworn off data warehouses at one point. But the concepts here that Dan initially came up with, and you made another observation there that it's a new concept, and I probably failed a little bit in my presentation, because I should have included the fact that this has been around for about 25 or 30 years. It's just that, and hopefully Dan isn't on the call today, but I think Dan tried to approach marketing this concept in a couple of ways that didn't help it gain traction initially. And so I think as Dan and his company has shifted their emphasis to more of an evangelistic approach and selling training rather than selling data models, I think that it's become much more widely adopted and easier to understand. In the old method, you had to kind of buy in first and then understand the benefits, which almost never works, right? So, but it is not really new. It's just sort of now getting some traction.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's, if you like, the terminology is new. I well remember sort of businesses that I've been in looking to leverage both the data warehouse that they already had and the data lake that the hype cycle had forced them into creating, if you like, and then wondering how they could get the two things to work together. And I think what you've articulated is is the fact that is the way forward. So can you just talk a little bit more, in perhaps in a bit more detail, on the specific advantages of incorporating those well-engineered common key structures from the vault design methodology into the current favored architecture?
Absolutely. But hopefully I won't go into too much detail, and I'll just apologize up front that I've got a bunch of backup slides here, and I'm going to have to click through a couple of them probably to get to one that is relevant. But essentially, maybe a good place to start here is to just understand, if we're talking about a hub and spoke here, on the left-hand side of my slide is our source data table coming in. In this case, it's our staged employee information table. And we're dividing the data in that source table into two structures, the hub and the satellite, which the satellite would be would live out on one of the spokes, right? So the employee ID becomes part of the hub, and then we see this hash key that is the technical key. It's the actual primary key. You'll see the term business key or BK in parentheses there. In the data vault world, we refer to the natural key as a business key. And then really the only thing that lives in the hub at that point is other metadata. All changeable or attribute data for that entity is stored in a satellite. And so that is why you see the date name and date of birth going to the satellite. And you'll see that the primary key for the satellite is that technical key from the hub, which is the shared link between the two. But the primary key there is also, in this satellite, is also comprised of a date, which is the date that this data hit the table. And so the satellite tracks those changes as we move forward, right? Is effective dating the data. That primary key is arrived at through applying, in most cases, a crypto hash to the incoming data. So in this case, it would be the employee ID. So we literally just take the employee ID, we run it in this example, simple example, we run it through the crypto hash, and we come up with this hash key, is what I tend to refer to it as. I think I may change my terminology to the internal or technical key going forward, but essentially it's the same thing. And then, of course, like any good collection, we have a fairly rigidly defined set of metadata that we apply to every object, and that metadata varies a little bit between the hub and the satellite here. So if you think of a simple data model, the structure looks a bit like this, right? If we would have a hub with a satellite, another hub with a satellite on the right, and then the relationship between those two, and I'll give some context to this drawing in just a second, is managed by the link, and optionally a satellite on the link. So what that looks like in an actual model is something like this, which is, we would have, extending my example, we have an employee who's assigned to a department in your organization. And so the employee's name and date of birth, as we saw on the previous slide, is in the satellite. The definition for the employee, which in this case is the ID, is managed in the hub. We don't add a row to the hub, by the way, if that employee data changes. Just because the name changes, we don't do anything in the hub, right? Just the satellite would get a new row. The link there, you can see how it's described with the link hash key, which is really just unique to that table. But the important piece is here, where we see the employee hash key linked in a relationship to the employee hub, and the department hash key over here. So this structure is capable of managing one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many relationships flexibly, and there's no change in code, there's no change in logic, there's no change in the collection at all if that relationship suddenly shifts from a one-to-one or a one-to-many to a many-to-many, for example. And then in terms of the crypto hash, essentially, this is what we're doing. We're taking the information coming from, in my example, the employee table, and we're sort of duplicating that data in the hub. We're representing it in its natural form in the business key, and then we're representing it in the encrypted internal form in that hash key. And again, just to reiterate, the reason that's important is and I actually just had this happen at a client, if the collection needs to shift here and the definition of an employee, the business rule changes from the employee ID is no longer the primary key, it's now employee ID and company. Certainly there's going to be some impacts to the collection and relationships here. But the way we would implement that in this hub and spoke environment would be, we would simply add and actually we might do this in a parallel structure. So we might build a new hub and it can sit right alongside the old hub. And we would just add the company ID or company name or whatever it is to that key structure. Both of those columns would go through the hash function. Now there's some rules around that. It gets a little technical. You have to do data conversions always the same way. So if you're converting a date to a string, you've got to always do that the same way. If you've got to send those columns through this function in the appropriate order, right? If you swap employee ID and company in their order, their parameter order into the function, you're going to get a different output value, right? So you have to apply some rules for consistency. But the beauty of it is that you don't have to change the structure of this table at all. I guess you do have to add a column, but you don't have to change the key structure. And if you think about the previous example where we were looking at this, a change to the key structure here, it isn't, the only thing that's changing is a value. So in our data vault example, we're going to change the actual value that we create for this row when we add the company ID, but we don't have to expand this key at all. We don't change the size of it, anything else. Extending that example, well, is that enough detail, or I can probably keep going? I'm happy to take
No. I think that's probably enough. Thanks, Glenn.
I warned you that I can be very technical.
Indeed. Can we quickly move on then? And Paul has written, have you come across Data Vault implementations using the decentralized data mesh architecture? If so, were they also successful, or is this approach more from the traditional sort of warehouse lake centralized data team?
Yeah, I don't have any clients who have declared that they have a data mesh. So I will disclose that I guess probably the technical answer to that's no. But I think I would also argue that anyone who has a CRM implementation that is heavily managed and influenced by their sales side of their business, in multitude of other potential systems, subsidiary companies in my clients that have essentially control of their own IT infrastructure and systems decisions. So I sort of believe every company has a data mesh, at least in terms of how the data is managed. Maybe not the technical side, but everyone has the same issues that data mesh is trying to address. And anytime that you encounter a system where because of organizational or cultural reasons in an organization, that system is decentralized from a management and governance standpoint, you have the issues of a data mesh are present. So that's a very long yes but no, I suppose, answer.
Brilliant, thank you. And Eric has written, can we assume ownership and governance would be covered by a good and comprehensive catalog, or should we seek to build this into the main data model?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm going to give you a similar answer. I'm going to give you both sides, 1 foot in both lanes answer. I would love nothing more than an integrated data model, with an integrated catalog. I've yet to see one actually happen. And I believe that is reflective of just organizational priority and organizational culture. If we think back to my slide with the 9 elements or 7 elements of a successful collection, every client that I work with is approaching those in a different sequence. And some are moving faster on the catalog side than others. And more often than not, however, there's an urgent need to show value to the business, which requires that integrated catalog to get pushed to the bottom of the list. So there's a practical aspect to all of this.
Well, I don't know. It's much of a question, but Barbara, who's question we're about to move on to came up with, boy, is that true to that particular answer. So perhaps
Cool.
you might sort of comment there.
I actually, as you all may know, Peter Aiken has been a primary mentor for me in the last 10, 15 years. And, Peter's written dozens of books, maybe hundreds of books, I don't know. And I have always think, am I going to write a book? And the truthful answer is probably no, because I don't have the patience. But if I did, I think I would want to write a book about how organizational culture affects how data is managed in an organization. Because the concepts are all the same, but it's the order and sequence that things get approached is influenced heavily by culture. A sales culture is extremely different from a federal government, governance style culture, right? So I guess that's a corollary answer, hopefully, to Barbara's comment, and I completely agree.
No, that I think that's right. You're entirely on the money. That's my experience tells me that you can go in there with sort of template answer of how it should be done, and then you spend the rest of your time trying to sort of crowbar that into the culture of how the business actually works, and therefore changing and fitting your implementation.
And I about half of my work is technical implementation work. I mean, I'm not trying to sell here, but my company does have tools that speed up the implementation of data vaults. That's what we do. And honestly, that's how we get our foot in the door most of the time. But whether we are introduced to an organization to build something quickly, or if we're introduced to help the executives prioritize and make a plan, invariably, whatever it was we weren't introduced to do becomes important, at some point, right? If you start with planning, building becomes important. If you start with building, governance becomes, and planning becomes important. More often than not, my clients want to build something to show value, and then it takes, I'll start preaching the gospel of governance and all of the other 12 points that DAMA has on the DAMA wheel, right? And for the most part, there's not much interest in many of those until we start to hit some speed bumps in the building process. And then all of a sudden, people start getting interested in governance and master data management, right? And things like that.
And you've actually sort of taken us directly into Barbara's question, which is, are there any products in the data vault arena that do she says, particularly good job of providing access to the business metadata, what the data actually means?
I'm not aware of any right now. I'm aware more, honestly, in my case, probably because of what I do, is of more products that are good at building, rapidly building the structures. Warescape claims to have a component of that. I'm not necessarily bought into their approach on that. So I'm sorry, Barbara, I don't think I have a good answer.
Okay, well, I mean, that's an honest answer, and that's really what we're after. So I think what you're saying there is there might be a few snake oil salespeople around at the moment telling you that if you buy their system, it is the answer to it's best thing since sliced bread, as we say on this side of the Atlantic, but they're probably not really selling you anything more than snake oil.
Yeah, and I brought us back to this slide, and it's probably my shameless self-promotion on my company, but I mean, we are completely product agnostic in my company. So I did have partnerships early in this with a couple of the vendors whose names we talked about today, but for the most part, those have been abandoned because we don't want to be married to any particular solution. And if you take anything at all away from today, beyond Data Vault's a great way to approach this, it would be that it's not really about which tool, it's more about how you use it.
Yeah, excellent. And just in case you don't see that on the questions, Barbara says, great, that's the answer that she thought it was. And she's worked with you in Arkansas at a bank previously. So a great,
Hi, Barbara.
she says a great
How are you?
presentation. Brilliant. I think we have got through all the questions. And as we are coming up to the end of our allotted time, Glenn, can I just say, from a personal point of view, fantastic presentation. A lot of, a lot of great information there, and a lot of food for thought. I know that I thoroughly enjoyed it, and by the reactions we've been getting from the people through their questions, but through their comments, I think everybody else seemed to enjoy it. So thanks very much indeed. For everybody else, we will be publishing this, the recording of this on iscdo.org/video, where you can get to see all our previous webinars as well. Until next time then, thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you, Glenn, for a terrific presentation, and I wish everybody a great day.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Thanks, Glenn. Pleasure to have you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.